The next person is another city manager. Mark Schwieterman is the city manager for Kettering. He has been at Kettering for just now 29 years. He's catching up with me on age. He's been city manager for about 12 years now, and previous to that he was budget manager and an assistant city manager. Mark today is going to be discussing the council manager form of government, effective city council, and council relations and meetings. And I tell you, you won't find somebody who does know this any better than Mark. So we welcome Mark, and come on up.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Good morning. As Brian mentioned, this is who I am, and I've been in the city of Kettering now for in my 30th year. Prior to that, I worked for Price Waterhouse back in the days when there were actually 8 large accounting firms, and kind of came to the city of Kettering by accident. Didn't want to travel anymore. Took a job that I thought would last about a year, and I was a little wrong. I fell in love with local government very quickly, and what we were trying to do, and really haven't really had a bad day in 30 years. Now, some bad things have happened, but I haven't had necessarily a bad day. So let's talk a little bit about the council manager form of government, and how it came about, and why we think today it's important. It started in the early 1900s. It was part of the progressive movement. So you probably recall there were some things going on in the early 1900s that maybe today we wouldn't be as proud of as we were back in the early 1900s. So there was, infighting among local government and leadership, there corruption, unethical behavior. So in order to try to stem the tide on that and go towards, as Mayor Compton said, a more professional form of government management, a little more transparency, and certainly in today's world, a lot more transparency, and also to be responsive to our residents and accountable to our residents. This form of government was created. Here are some folks that helped us get to this new form of government. These are some well-known folks. I'm sure you'll recognize the Cox name down in the Cincinnati area, and in the early 1900s, late 1800s, the Cox machine that ran Cincinnati. George was a great guy. He was in charge of setting tax rates down there in the Cincinnati, Hamilton County area back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But what he didn't understand was the tax rates should be set equally for all. It turned out that most of the property that he owned had better tax rates than property owned by others. So that's an issue. Nookie Johnson, you can kind of see who he's walking with there. I want to get this quote correct because it was a good quote. Nookie apparently believed in the Bible. Some of the early careers in the Bible, and he kind of believed in those as well. And he ran Atlantic City for about 30 years. He had to stop running in Atlantic City when they put him in jail, and he specialized in gambling, obviously, bootlegging, and prostitution. So not some of the things I hope any of you have in your strategic plans for your leadership and policy goals. And then there's Big Bill Thompson, who ran Chicago in the early 1900s, and he was quoted as being the most unethical mayor in history. And he earned that title for his close affiliation with Al Capone. He was also the one, when he passed away and they went through his house, they found 2 boxes, lock boxes, and inside those boxes was $1.8 million in cash. That cash did not come from his W-2 earnings. So there were some things going on in local government, and the council manager form of government came out of those activities. Started really in Staunton, Virginia, Sumter, South Carolina, and the city of Dayton. And Dayton was, back in 1914, it was the largest city at the time to go to the council manager form of government. And so this is the audience participation time. Most of you are from this area, I assume. What do you suppose happened in the early 1900s that brought about this form of government for the city of Dayton? The flood, absolutely right. So before the Miami Conservancy District, we had flooding. And after the 1913 flood, the business leaders in the community got together and said, we need a better plan, somebody to take care of this. So born out of that was the council manager form of government, and then also the government entity that's responsible for making sure the water stays where the water's supposed to stay. So that really didn't come out of corruption in the city. It came out of needing a professional management to ensure a disaster like that didn't happen again. And then Westerville, Ohio, unfortunately in the news lately, but they were the first village in Ohio to have the council manager form of government. I'll refer a couple times to statistics from ICMA, and that is the kind of association of all professional city managers, the International City Manager form of government. So 105 million people in the United States live in communities that have this form of government. 48% of our cities, 800 counties, and I think this is the last bullet point is a statistic. I didn't think the number would be this great, but the cities of greater than 100,000, 62% use this form. So it is a very prevalent form of government that you're operating in. And it really, I hope, brings the best of both worlds to your community. Strong political leadership with strong professional managerial leadership as well. Something you should know about me as a city manager. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not any other party. My job is to act in a nonpartisan way. In the community that I work in, Kettering, our council members are also nonpartisan. So we spend no time talking about what the Republican Party in Montgomery County wants or what the Democrat Party in Montgomery County wants. That's not necessarily the case in your communities. Some local communities, such as Miamisburg, Ohio, have partisan politics, and then Democrats and Republicans. But in Kettering, well, we do not. I would assume in your charters, that's where that's established, and that's where it's established in our charter, that there is not partisan politics. But it's certainly very important for me as a manager not to get involved in that. Now, do I know which members of my council are Republican? You better believe it. I also know which ones are Democrats, and I know which one's an independent. They don't have to tell me. You got to figure these out as part of knowing who you're working with and where we go. So, but I did want to make a point of that we are not to be partisan in any manner as a manager. City council is policy, and at the very end, there's a slide that I try to explain the very delicate meshing of policy versus operations. But it's city council and the mayor's role for policy, and it's my role as a city manager in charge of the staff to implement those policies, run the operations of the city, when it gets to policy, I implement it, and sometimes I advise on what I think might be good policy. You know, what's the best way to handle our feral cat population or things of that nature. I might give some advice on that, but ultimately it's council's decision on what that policy should be. So I use this slide for the kids in high school and grade school when I give presentations to give them some feel of what businesses are like and what governments are like. I used to say when I was the first 15 years of my career, I was all about the numbers of the city. I collected taxes, I did the budget, I worked in our finance department, and I used to try to, hey, we run like a business. Let's do things effective and efficiently. It's really not true. When you get into the manager's office, you realize you start making a lot of decisions that have nothing to do with the numbers. It has to do with serving your citizens. And you have to serve your citizens in certain ways, and some of those ways are not financially prudent, but it's your obligation to provide that service. So we can't really run like a business. Very few businesses run to lose money, right? Government sometimes has certain operations that are going to lose money. So while we're set up like a business, we do have a little different mission. So you can see you have your stockholders, your chairman of the board of directors, your CEO, and your vice president, and on down. And you've all seen, corporate charts. The council manager form of government, ultimately, as you know, the people who vote you in are the people who run the community, and those are your citizens and your taxpayers. And then you have a mayor and city council, the city manager, and then in our case, 9 or 10 department heads and assistant city manager. And that's the format and structure that we utilize. And it's important throughout that policy-making process to remember the citizens and taxpayers. And it's important to remember the administration of the city, where the city manager's role is and where your role is as elected officials. So I'm going to bore you a little bit with how Kettering is in hopes to show you that there are differences among us in local government, but the structure of the council manager form of government is very similar. In Kettering, our voters select our council, our mayor, our judges. We have 2 municipal court judges and our clerk of courts. We have a municipal court that serves not only Kettering, but it serves Washington Township, Centerville, and Moraine. And we have some Ohio State Patrol activities as well. But we are the host community of that court, and by Ohio law, that means we own it. And so in a negative way, and Mayor Compton is very familiar with how this works, if we don't make money on the courts, it's the city of Kettering taxpayers who pay the difference because we own the court. So it's a very important policy decision that's been made by City Council to start and maintain this court. And if I were to go back 40 years and try to determine, okay, why do we have a Kettering Municipal Court, it's for the convenience of our southern area residents to come into a suburban court, come in quickly, get out quickly, and it be in their area and not have to go, in our case, to downtown Dayton. Now, 40 years ago, that was probably a bigger decision. In today's world with electronic payment and the roadway systems, it's not as big a deal as it used to be. But because of that, our voters elect the judges and the clerk of courts. Our city council appoints me, the city manager, and at one time appointed the clerk of council, and that's in the charter. Those are the 2 positions that they appoint. Recently, our city council passed a motion or a resolution that gave me the authority to manage and hire a clerk of council. Now, I worked with the council when we hired that person and made sure they interviewed the candidate and were happy with the candidate as well. We did that for essentially restructuring reasons. We were reducing staff and needed to consolidate operations, and we moved the council office and the manager's office into one office so that we could reduce the administrative staff that we have. And we now have a clerk of council who spends about half her time on the council activities, running the council meetings, getting the meetings done, the other half of the time helping us in the city manager's office with the administrative duties. So you're going to hear this a lot through this presentation. The city council appoints me and only me from that regard. Yes?
Who appoints your law director?
So another great question, and the question is who appoints your law director? And this is where the city of Kettering can be different from your community. Our charter states that everybody works for me and then I work for the council. Your charter may say that city council appoints the city manager, the law director, and in many cases the finance director or the fiscal officer. So that's very prevalent. The city of Moraine has that situation where the finance director reports to the council. That should be and is determined by your charter. So your charter can be different in where you would appoint the law director and even the finance director as well. And in those scenarios, then it's my job as the manager to work very effectively with those other appointed officials, even though they don't work for me. It's very hard to run a city if you don't understand the finances and have collaboration with the elected or the appointed finance director from the council side.
But how do you pick?
Please.
In Kettering, how do they pick?
In Kettering, I appoint the law director. So we have a law director who works for our staff, and you know I go through an interview process and appoint them. So, and it is an interesting relationship because, as you know, the law director advises city council. So often I will have a discussion with my law director, and the discussion will ultimately end up with as you know, I also advise city council. So you know that we have to balance that and make sure we're doing our jobs. Again, specific to Kettering, our mayor is elected at large by the people. And then we have 2 council members that are elected at large as well. and then 4 council members that are elected by district. And again, this is all set up in our charter. This may be unique for Kettering, but we spend very little time talking about the districts. We know our council members are elected by their districts, but I don't present capital improvement projects by district. I don't present property maintenance reports by district. I'm sure the council members see something up there and go, ooh, that's in my district. But we never do it that way. We prefer to operate with this current council, and they prefer it as well, the city as a whole, what's best for the city as a whole. And it works very well. Where the districts come into play is when the residents pick up the telephone. They go to that little magnet we gave them that has all the phone numbers. They find their council member, they call their council member. So that's really where the districts come into play at that point. Our vice mayor is appointed by the city council. They do that every 2 years. So they essentially get together in a workshop, appoint a vice mayor for a 2-year term. So don't want to overstate the obvious, but obviously the elected officials have the political power. They share their responsibilities. I know in some communities it's different, but in Kettering, the mayor is 1 vote, the council members are 1 vote. Our mayor votes on everything. We have 7 votes on each resolution or ordinance. In some communities, the mayor is a tiebreaker, doesn't vote unless there is a vote to be had. Mayor Dick Church, I'll use Miamisburg as an example a couple of times today, mainly because I'm familiar with it. I lived in Miamisburg for a decade. Mayor Dick Church has been in Miamisburg for as long as Miamisburg has existed, and they're celebrating their 200th birthday this year. Carl, I'll pay for that later, won't I, when Mr. Church sees that? But he often talks about the fact that he's been mayor for over 20 years and hasn't voted because they haven't had the ties. They are the policy-making body. The council is the policy-making body, and I think of that in terms of your strategic plan, your mission, your vision, your strategic plan, establishing the policy, and where they as a community want to go. They're obviously community leaders, and you've probably figured out, those of you that are newly elected thought the campaigning was hard. You've probably now found out that you're actually campaigning every day. Because your responsibility includes being out there in the community, going to the ribbon cuttings, going to the open houses, going to not-for-profit events, and things of that nature. You're the face of the community for your residents. And so we poke fun at that a little bit, but the mayor does get the big scissors at the ribbon cuttings, not the council members. We let the mayor have the big scissors. They are made out of wood and cannot hurt anybody. And that's also very important. So their roles, again, I mentioned the strategic plan, establishing the tax levels, setting the land use plan, whether or not we're going to have annexation, and then, of course, where does the money go? What do we use it for in the budget? So tax levels, for example, in the city of Kettering, we raised our income tax rate back in 2006 and 2007. And it was the city council's responsibility to make the decision based upon staff recommendations to put on the ballot an increase in the income tax rate and then let the voters decide. So they made that decision to establish the tax levels. They also control the land use plans. In our community, what that means is if we want to rezone a property from residential to industrial, that request made by the landowner goes to our planning commission. Our planning commission holds public hearings, deliberates, and votes on a recommendation regarding that rezoning. That recommendation is then certified to the city council. The city council holds public hearing and deliberation and makes the final vote on that land use plan, on that rezoning. So in our case, Planning Commission is a recommending body taking those actions to the City Council. In other communities, Planning Commission could be the final answer. In other communities, the Planning Commission is not a part of the process at all. So it differs by communities, but ultimately City Council is responsible for how we utilize our land. Now, administratively, that's a large part of my job, is maintaining the zoning code and making sure that residents and businesses are complying with the zoning code, and if we want to change the zoning code, working with City Council to do that. The City of Kettering recently essentially took their zoning code and put it over here and created a brand new one. And it was about a 2.5-year process to work through writing that zoning code at the administrative level, going out into the community and getting feedback on it, bringing it back, changing it, going to the Planning Commission, changing it again, going to City Council and getting it approved. And that was an entire rewrite of our zoning code. Annexation is an answer, and how many of you have already been involved in an annexation case? Certainly the experts of annexation, the City of Centerville, have. But that is always a huge policy decision, because it's usually a property owner coming to you and saying, we would like to be in your city. Well, by saying that, what they're really saying is, please get us out of the township that we're currently in. That obviously pits neighbors against neighbors, and usually ends up in court. Hopefully, ultimately, it's for the best of the property, best of the owner, and best for the region, not just the community. But in my experience, we've done, I guess, really 2 of them since I've been in the city manager's office. It always ends up in court and having the courts make the decision. But I mention that specifically because that is obviously a policy decision on whether you're going to increase your corporate boundary in the land that you have in your community. The budget is what we call in Kettering the major policy document. It is where the policy decisions, some are made and most are implemented. So in my opinion, as a previous budget manager, it's the most important document that we create as staff in working with council to determine what their goals are for the upcoming year and 5 years as we establish that budget. So how do city councils act? You've all, had we had this meeting a month ago, the first time it was scheduled, you'd be a little newer. You might have only had 1 or 2 council meetings, and now you're experts. You've had 2 more. So maybe some of this is very out of date for you, but mainly the roles of council in a council meeting are to adopt ordinances, which are essentially laws, pass resolutions, do the proclamations, the feel-good stuff. You may have already acted in a quasi-judicial matter as well. That being, for instance, if somebody appeals the decision of or the Planning Commission, in our city, those appeals come to City Council. And we essentially turn the council meeting into a courtroom for those, because it is a judicial matter and we run it in a judicial way. So you may have come across that. As I mentioned, you hire the city manager, the clerk of council, and then we talked earlier about you as council may also hire the finance director and the law director. So again, with these ordinances, those are laws. Those are long-term. Those are things that can only be changed by you or another city council in the future. So they last a long time. In the city of Kettering, it's a law that if you're under the age of, and I think it's 15, if you're under the age of 15, you have to wear a bicycle helmet. That's a law. It's going to stay there until a different city council comes in and says it's now going to be 18. And then they would have to pass a law to change the law. Whereas a resolution is very short-term in nature. We use resolutions to authorize me to do things. So the resolution would be authorize the city manager to purchase a fire truck utilizing 2018 budgeted dollars. Very short-term in nature, gives me the authority to go out, go through the purchasing process and buy the truck. I can't buy a truck in 2020 under that same resolution. Proclamations, by now you understand what proclamations are. Those are the Breast Cancer Awareness Month, National Feral Cat Week, whatever it might be. As you can tell, feral cats are an issue everywhere, so I thought I'd use that. Then we also have how you make things happen. So you'd have the adoption of the budget. You would have discussion with staff, and I hope we'll talk about that a lot here in a minute, but we will have discussion with staff, whether collective or individually. And again, it's about showing up. both as a city manager and as an elected official. It's about going to the events and hearing what people have to say and listening. Listening is, as you probably imagined, I'm certain you learned it during your campaign, that when you knock on a front door, you're going to do a lot of listening, not a lot of talking. And it's the same way when you go out into community events. And for me as a staff member, that's a great way for us to get feedback. When somebody says to their elected official, you know, there's a pothole on my residential street, you know, while we have staff driving around trying to find those things, we're not going to get them all. It's great. It's a great tool for us when that elected official comes back and says, hey, I heard about a pothole, and we can go get it and get it fixed. So my role is essentially the chief executive officer or the chief administrative officer. My very negative side of my business is I get to fire employees. The very positive side of my business is we get to hire employees and introduce them to local government. We prepare the budget recommendation. In Kettering, we prepare the budget. Some communities, it could be a different scenario, but in most it is the administration prepares the budget with guidance from City Council. Then City Council gives us guidance back on our draft, changes are made, a final budget is presented to you at a council meeting, and a resolution is passed to appropriate those funds. Again, I attend meetings. Did I mention I attend meetings? I attend a lot of meetings. Most of the job during the day is meeting with my staff, and most of the job at night then is attending meetings with the community. We are policy advisors, but again, we're not making the final decision. We advise, and then City Council decides how they want to move along. And in Kettering and in your community as well, I'm sure, very small, off-the-cuff conversations can lead to major policy decisions. So when a council member asks the question, how do we handle this? When I give the very quick answer on how we handle that, and the council member starts to scratch their head a little bit, I know that I'm about to get a research project. And that's how this works, and it works great, because it forces us to not, well, that's how we've always done it. A new elected official comes in and says, well, that doesn't quite seem the way I think it should. What if we did X? It's a great tool. It allows us to do some research, present back to the council. Hey, we've been doing it this way for 20 years. Maybe it's time to change. Here's what we could do. So it doesn't have to be this 12-hour council retreat where you make policy decisions. It could be a 2-minute phone call from a council member that results in, 2 months later, a policy decision being made. Other duties as assigned. I'm going to make it very clear to you, please don't ask your city manager to pick up your dry cleaning. Don't do it. But I will pick you up and take you to the mayor's and manager's dinner on Wednesday night. So just work out with your manager where the lines are, communicate with them. They're here to help you, and you're there to help them. So it's all about communications. But there are many other duties as assigned, and they're all very appropriate, except dry cleaning. So who initiates and who influences City Council? The obvious answer is the voters. In Kettering, it's not residents for us. It's not voters. It really comes down to taxpayers. All of our residents are taxpayers. All of our businesses are taxpayers. All of our employees of those businesses are taxpayers. So we try to think of all of them in that realm. There's that saying in our local income tax code, it's really taxation without representation. Well, we're trying to represent those employees that pay tax that don't live in our community. An example of that would be on a small scale, but kind of sets the tone for us. We have what's called a fair share policy implemented by City Council. If you pay tax dollars in Kettering, you're a resident for all of our services. So if you want to join our rec center, you pay the resident rate. Okay, very simple thing, but shows value to those folks who aren't able to vote for our elected officials, but are in our community on a daily day paying taxes. And in our case, Kettering's population grows during the day. So we want to make sure that we include all of those folks. And I will give away a little economic development secret for you in regards to that policy. when we're courting companies into our community and the questions they ask, one of the things we make very clear to them is that you are considered a resident for all of our services. And not only will we give you resident fees for our rec center and services, we'll give you a corporate program, if you'd like, for that as well. So you can utilize some of these basic entry-level services to incentivize is a strong word, but to show value to new companies and existing companies that are in your community. Boards and commissions, you have a number of them in your community, and of course they are providing you feedback. Board of Zoning Appeals, Planning Commission, Board of Community Relations, Sister City Committee, all of them are appointed by you to help you. So you will receive feedback from them. Staff, obviously, interest groups, interested parties. An example of that would be if you live anywhere near Kettering, you'll know we proposed the idea of taking a major bridge out of our community because of the cost to replace it and the limited amount of traffic on it. And ultimately, an interested party group formed, and they created the Save the Bridge campaign. And that group did a wonderful job of providing input to City Council before they made decisions that impacted that bridge. So you will have these interested party groups that form. Obviously, just because you have a charter at the local level doesn't mean you can do anything you want. You still have to abide by the rules of the state and the federal government. A place where city managers will go for information, and certainly council members will go for information, are the National League of Cities, the Ohio Municipal League, the United States Conference of Mayors. So there are all these agencies out there, ICMA, where you can get benchmark information, you can get ideas. When you have a question, if you're one of those folks who likes to bring a solution, you can go to these agencies and use their data to try to verify what those solutions might be. And we as city managers, we are going to steal from each other. Greg Horn, former city manager of Centerville, if he did something I thought was really, really good, it quickly had my logo on it, and we were going to do it as well, right? I mean, there's no shame in copying other communities if they have a good idea out there, and we do it quite a bit. Surveys, every 2 years we take a survey of all of our residents to see what they're looking for, and we call it a general satisfaction survey. We want to know, generally speaking, how satisfied are you? And fortunately in the city of Kettering, for the last decade or so, our residents are 97% satisfied. But in those little small survey questions, you are going to find things that you can take from the survey results and do better. And in today's environment, surveys are much easier. Used to be the hard copy mailed to the home, very few people would fill it out. And we would mail out thousands and hope to get back 400. Our last survey was done using the email addresses off of our waste management trash accounts, using those email addresses, and we got almost 1,200 survey responses done online. So it's much easier today to get input. Now, careful what you ask for. You got to have some thick skin, because when people can sit at their keyboard and not talk to you directly, they can say some things that they might not say to you in person. But yeah, the anonymity is sometimes good, sometimes bad. But again, glean through all that stuff, find the stuff that you really need to know to improve your policies and improve your services. Again, the limitations are the constitutions of the state and the federal government, your own city charter, which can only be changed by a vote of the people in your community, judicial action. So sometimes it's not just the U.S. rules, but then what some court said in the interpretation of those rules. And as you know, that changes by court decision. So you have to have somebody like your law director who's staying up on those recent decisions, because it may very well change how you're supposed to act. And you need to stay on top of that. Obviously, you're going to have financial limitations. If we had unlimited resources, every community would give every resident exactly what they wanted. Because you don't have unlimited resources, there are going to be some winners and some losers in your decisions. In your job as council members and as city administration, is try to achieve that perfect balance to better your community as a whole. Obviously, you know, the will of the people will speak, and the professional recommendations and legal impact. I have that up there simply because we've talked a little bit about law directors and they're advising city council. They are professionals. They're doing this for a living. If they give you advice, think very hard about not accepting that advice. It should be very easy to accept the advice, very difficult to not accept the advice, because when you don't accept the advice of your legal provider, you're opening yourselves and your community up to an outcome down the road. So again, my encouragement is just make sure you think long and hard about that. Get another opinion, that's fine, but make sure that you think long and hard before you go the other route from your legal advice. So obviously my role is to translate that policy into implementation. We do that by, again, modeling the appropriate actions of other communities in the state. We have to hire the appropriate personnel. We give directives to our staff and our committees. We put rules and regulations in place. So up here you have the law. Below the law, you have the rules and regulations, the internal administrative policies that make sure we're following those laws. And then my favorite question, is it in the budget? At some point in time, somebody has to ask the question, is it in the budget? And if it's not in the budget, what do we take out of the budget to get it funded? Or do we go to city council and say, we need a little bit more money to achieve this objective? So ultimately, you have to ask that question. And of course, in my community, I find it's often asked of me by our council members when we're presenting topics. And this is just a basic assumption that all of you have probably in your household and you have seen in your cities. But the efficiency and the effectiveness of what we do is very important because we do not have those unlimited resources to operate with. So now I'm going to go into ground rules, and I'm hoping this is where we'll have some discussion. But city council should have some ground rules. City administration certainly has ground rules. And so know your charter. It's usually a very thin document. Make sure you understand your role as defined by the charter, and make sure you read the whole charter so that you don't go astray of the charter. You would not want your competitor to come in the next time you're running for office and point out that you didn't have knowledge of the charter. So make sure you understand the rules as developed by the charter. Remember that you're just hiring me. It is inappropriate behavior in the council manager form of government for you as council to come to me and say, you need to fire department head A, and I want it done by Friday. It's not your role. You can certainly let me know you're displeased with department head A, but it's my role to decide what happens to department head A. Now, if I don't do with department head A what you want done with department head A, your role comes into play. You can get the majority votes you need and you can let go of me. But that's the only person that you can do that to, unless also law directors, finance directors, or clerk of council. This one is a statement, very strong statement. I think we should have some discussion about it. Council shall deal with employees solely through the city manager. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion on this. There is a lot of discussion in my organization about it. There are many versions of this. I know of other managers who basically tell their city council, you talk to me and me only. There are other city managers who don't seem too concerned with this clause. There are some who think it's a charter violation for council to go and talk directly to other employees. There's got to be a balance, and at some point here later I'm going to talk about communications, but there has to be a balance. The only person you're holding accountable for the operations of the city is the city manager. And as such, the city manager then needs to know what the issues are. And he can't be held accountable for those issues if you're dealing with those issues at a level below him, and he doesn't know about it. So in our operation in Kettering, I sit in an office suite. In that office suite is myself, my assistant city manager, my economic development manager, community information manager, our compliance manager, the clerk of council, and my secretary. And essentially what we've told our city council is just get inside that office suite. Make the phone call to that number. If I'm not in, tell whoever answered the phone what your issue is, and we'll get it addressed. We do it that way because I meet with that office suite every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock for a long time. And we go through everything that's going on throughout the city and making sure we're staying on top of things. So I know that I'm going to get the communication that Council Member A called on Monday, concerned about a property maintenance issue on the west side of town, wants a result by Friday. I'll know that because I get that report directly. If they go to the property maintenance staff person who's driving a white car through the city looking at things, and they stop him and tell him, hey, you need to get over there and do that, and he doesn't come back and tell me, and he doesn't take care of it or doesn't address it in the manner at which the council member likes, it's difficult to hold me accountable for that transaction because I wasn't a part of it. And that's really what this is about. It's about communicating with the folks that are accountable for the actions. I'm sure it will not surprise you that somebody in our organization, and I have 1,200 total employees, 500 or so full-time equivalents. There's somebody in my organization that sees something differently than I do, right? It's going to happen. Well, if that person sees it differently than I do, and they respond directly to a council member, you are going to get an answer that wouldn't have come from me. My answer would have been, hey, you need to go back out and adjust the way we're handling that. And I would tell you, the council member, how we're going to handle it. So it's really an accountability issue, a communications issue. You have to work out what's best in your community and talk to your manager openly about it and what their beliefs are. Like I said, there are really 3 levels of this. Don't do it at all. Do it the way we do it in Kettering. Just get inside the office and we'll get the information to me. I don't really care. Just talk to whoever you want to. Now, your newly elected officials, is it important to you to develop a relationship and a rapport with department heads? Absolutely. You're going to go to ribbon cuttings, community events. They're going to be there. Most of your department heads probably live in your community. You're going to see them at the grocery store. Talk to them socially. Have a good time. Talk to them about city stuff. But when you say to them, I saw this and I want you to fix it, that's the wrong conversation, in my opinion. When you want that kind of conversation, you need to come to the manager, the person you're holding accountable for getting that done. It's important that you as an individual council member, and think of yourselves as one vote, doesn't try to direct in the entirety of the situation without collaboration with the other council members. So there are times when I'll have to say, you know what, that's a great idea. We should discuss that. I'll put that on the workshop agenda. And then when the whole council as a whole comes together, I put on the agenda that topic and we discuss it as a group together to make sure that it's not one vote, but it is, hey, that's a great idea, Mark, go look at that. And that's how we handle it in our organization. We meet an hour and a half before every council meeting. Would I like to meet a half hour before every council meeting? Absolutely. But we meet an hour and a half before every council meeting. And during those workshops, we go through those very types of things where we receive this input, how would you like to handle it? And it's a great tool because it's face-to-face communications. I'm not a big fan of the email that goes to all 7 council members and asks a question. And you're probably going to learn later today why I'm not a big fan of that. If you hit the reply all function and say, here's what I think, and then another council member hits the reply all function and says what they think, what do you think is taking place? A vote, essentially a public meeting. You're essentially having a public meeting, and I am sure that the Piqua attorney that will be here later will tell you that that's a violation of the open meetings law.
But why is it possible for someone to send out an email with all the council members, and that's not considered a email?
Right.
Whereas if I reply all, that it is a council meeting.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell me the difference in that.
Well, what I would say to you is ask that very question of Stacy Wall when she gets here. My response to that is something initiated by a resident to all council members doesn't constitute a meeting. It's the dialogue between all council members on that issue that creates the meeting. But I could be absolutely wrong. So consult your attorney later in today's presentation.
I have.
Where are we? I'm sorry, yeah. So the question is, if, as a newly elected official, you have a lot of questions. And you get a lot of questions asked of you during the campaign and a lot of questions asked of you as soon as you get in office. And what's the best way to get all those questions and have a dialogue with your city manager to get some answers, to develop what I'll just call that core knowledge of operations? And one thing I will say is, don't hesitate to set up a meeting with your city manager. You don't just have to meet at council meetings, right? One of you, or two or three, if you have a body of 7, can come in and chat with your city manager, and it's not a public meeting. So don't hesitate to set up meetings and say, hey, I've got all these questions, come in. We as managers like that better because we can have some face-to-face dialogue and walk you through the process. What we do in Kettering is, as soon as a newly elected official is elected in November, between November and January 1st, we bring them in. And I take them on what we call the 4-hour tour. And they meet in my office for about an hour and a half, and we go over all those basic things. Then we drive the community and show our newly elected resident all the things she had no idea existed in her community, right? Take her to all the underbelly of the community so you can see where the public service yard is, where the snow plows are, where the salt dome is, where the fire engines are kept, and give them a real appreciation for the assets of the administration. And in that 4 hours, you can answer a lot of those basic questions. But again, when you start to build up those questions, I have breakfast with a council member, frequently, or lunch with another one frequently, just for that sole purpose, so they can go through their list. And that works great. If you do it email, one question at a time, we all know what it's like to continuously get emails, right? Dialogue and discussion and communication seems to work a lot better. And an entry training session like this one, we do a similar training session for just our own operations for our council members. And I walk them door to door and have them meet the directors. Those people I don't really want them talking directly to, I take them door to door, have them meet them, because they, as I said before, they need to have a professional relationship with them so they recognize each other and know who they are. Yeah, absolutely. And the budget is a great document to learn how we do things. It certainly gives you the policy direction of the council, and then gives you, here's how the funds are set up to operate your community. So again, I'm biased towards budgets, having prepared them for a living, but there's a lot of good information in there that is more than just numbers, and you can get a better feel for how things are operated. I would suggest, and if you're having problems as a council, work with your council and city manager to establish council rules where you have defined rules of how you're going to treat each other, how you're going to work with each other, how you're going to interact during council meetings and workshops. If you're having problems, sometimes you need to write it down. I would also make sure you understand, I made a big point of the legal guidance before, but also your ethical standards as an elected official. You have, as Ohio ethic laws, make sure you know what they are and make sure you follow them. My advice to you is accept nothing, and then you have nothing to worry about. But also know that your guidelines for gifts as elected officials are different than my guidelines for gifts as an appointed official. So don't assume that they're the same. They're not. Our internal policy as city administration in Kettering is we accept, just don't accept. The Christmas cookies, fine. The Ohio State football tickets, no. So just, keep in mind the ethics rules that you have are different than the city administration. Again, I mentioned the ICMA, and they're out there to help you. There's 11,000 members in that. And the ICMA for us is our code of conduct, is probably the biggest thing that they provide to us as managers. My code of conduct is an 8.5 by 11 on my bulletin board right by my phone. You keep it where it's near so that you don't forget why you're here. You're here to serve. So again, some ground rules, and go to the last three because really I think that's where it's all about. It's about communication and it's about trust. You're all working together as council, and you're all working together as council with your administrator. And it's very important that you have the trust to get that done, and that you have the communications. It was a very good point that was brought up about how do you ask questions. And again, I think it's very important that you communicate, you meet, you discuss. You don't grow a list of things you're unhappy with and never discuss them with the manager. There may be a very simple, reasonable explanation that would take half of those things off your list and reduce your stress. But if you build the list and never talk to the administrator, he can't help you and you can't help him. So, work together and communicate through that process. No surprises is obvious for all of us. We don't like it at all. None of us do, I'm sure. So just make sure that, again, you're communicating. I mentioned earlier that we meet for an hour and a half before the council meeting. 2 days before that, I will get an email from council members that says, hey, resolution number 6, can you give me more clarity on point 7? So then when we go into workshop, I give that clarity to all 7 of the council members, not just to the one who asked the question, right? And we go through it in workshop. We have what's called a council agenda, is the first agenda item on the workshop. We go through every agenda item to make sure they don't have any questions. If they do, we answer them in the workshop. Then we go upstairs, and they may ask the question. Upstairs, we're now on television. They may ask the question again, but they know the answer I'm going to give, and I know the question I'm going to get. So at the end of every resolution, the mayor asks the manager to comment on the resolution, and I give the comment, a comment they have seen already in writing in their packet. I give that comment. At the end of that comment, I'd say, Your Honor, I'd be happy to answer any other questions. At that point, I put my head down and turn my mic off because there's not supposed to be any other questions, right? We've already been through this. And when there are, and it can happen, it's going to happen, when there are, you don't want to give that council member that blank stare. I don't know the answer. And then I do this and I do this. Anybody know the answer? And if nobody knows the answer, it looks bad for all of us. So we try to get that out of the way before we go upstairs. But you also want to make sure you share the information with your residents. So we handle it that way, and there's no surprises in it, and it works better. But there are going to be times, obviously, in council meetings where I'm going to get a question I don't know the answer to, and you have to understand that I trust you enough and you trust me enough that I'm going to say, Your Honor, I don't know the answer to that question. If that impacts the vote, then perhaps maybe we should table the vote on this resolution until we can get you that answer. Because if we don't know the answer, we can't make it up. That would be our first mistake and will get me fired because you'll find out later I made it up. So we're not going to do that. Have fun and celebrate success. That's something we forget as staff. And certainly council can as well, because sometimes everything you hear is not good. But remember, when the good stuff happens, celebrate it, have fun, and enjoy it. And I mentioned earlier we'd have a slide that kind of draws this sketchy way of how we're going to interact with each other. But obviously you are on the left-hand side for mission and policy. That's your role. There's going to be a little bit where I play in that. And then you're on the right-hand side for administration and management. And I can take no credit for this slide, but many years ago somebody else gave this presentation, and that's the slide I kept from it. Because I really do think it shows you what your responsibilities are, but know that some days are different, and you might be into that administration side just a little bit, and I might be into that policy side just a little bit as well. Social media. Obviously, social media was not here in 1989 when I started my career. I didn't even have a laptop or a PC when I started my career at the city. And in that evolution, I've had laptops, computers, iPads, pagers, cell phones, flip phones, and now we're today to what I call the dread of society, instantaneous viral social media. How do you control it? And how do you get feedback back to the manager that this is out there? Treat it as no different than reading an email from a citizen or getting a letter from a citizen or having a conversation at the grocery store. Get the information you think is necessary to the city manager and basically say, have you seen this? Right? And then let us try to address the issues with social media. We have a person in our community that handles social media. They monitor what folks are saying, and they put out the information as well. And some communities call it rumor control. They actually have a menu item on their website called rumor control. And they post on that page all the stuff that people are saying out there, and then they put the answer. So there'll be like a button on your website that says rumor control. You click on that, and then the city manager or their staff will put paragraphs there that try to correct misinformation. The city of Fairborn is very good at it. They don't wait for the misinformation. They put the information out there before the misinformation starts. If they think there's something that could be misinterpreted or whatnot, they'll go ahead and put it out right away. Social media is very hard to control, so don't think you're going to control it. There are going to be people out there anonymously that are going to make comments that are untrue, or they're going to make comments that aren't nice. You can't pick your battles with all of them, but what I will advise you is you have to have a social media policy. If you're going to have a city Facebook page, Twitter page, Instagram, whatever it might be, make sure that you have a policy that is formulated by staff, approved by your law director, because there are rules. So, for example, if you say if I put a Facebook post out there about my new fire station, and some citizen puts a post up there that says your new fire stations are a waste of time, effort, money, and they're ugly. Because his post is on point, it relates to my post, I cannot, by policy, delete his post from our page. I can respond to it. Thank you very much for your input. If you'd like further details on our fire station, please contact the city manager at. Sounds like maybe I've posted that before, but I don't take it down. If I put a post up that says, look at my fire station, and they put a post up that says, so-and-so in the Parks Division cuts grass poorly and should be fired, that's not related to my post, we can take it off the page. Okay? So there's rules out there that govern how you can handle social media and make sure you have a policy. There's a very good point made out there that says social media will police itself. And when somebody puts something that's just crazy out there, other citizens get involved and correct it, and you don't really even have to take an action. There are other times, like you said, where you're going to need to take action. And my advice to you is when you do that, make sure somebody on the city manager staff sees the post as well so that they have the right information that you've put out there for any future questions that come up. Again, sharing the information with your administrative team so they know what's going on. And it can vary by charter, but boards and commissions are normally established by your charter, appointed by the city council. So they are your people out in the community serving a defined role who can provide input to you on certain subjects. So for example, and I'll choose our Board of Community Relations. Their role is to ensure that our community is inclusive and helpful to all. And they will host events and do things. They might receive feedback or information that they think is pertinent to policy adopted by City Council. So that board or commission will forward information to the City Council to try to initiate action. So the relationship there is very important. For one reason, you're appointing them. So there's some assumption that you know who they are, whether you know them personally, whether you interviewed them. They didn't just show up on the board without anybody knowing who they are. So you have a relationship. And then utilize that relationship because they are going to hear things on a very specific topic that you may not hear as a council member. So you want to make sure that you're communicating back and forth, checking in with them. At the end of your council meeting, you might have a segment called Council Committee Update. That's where you say, hey, I attended the BZA meeting, or I attended the Board of Community Relations meeting, I attended the Sister Cities Committee dinner, and here's what they're working on and here's what they're doing. So that's what I mean by that is simply you've defined them for a specific purpose, allow them to communicate with you and help you on that purpose. Well, in some communities, there are there could be an even vote, and that's why the mayor is left out of the vote, because then he's a tiebreaker. In the city of Kettering, our mayor votes because he's elected at large by the community, by the charter. So he's been elected by the community to represent them. And so we have 7 council members. He should vote. That's a nice odd number. And in my opinion, because he's elected by the community, he has the right to vote, right? The mayor of Miamisburg is elected by the community and doesn't vote. That's what their charter says. But they also have 9 council members, maybe 8. So for obvious reasons, he needs to be a tiebreaker occasionally, which apparently hasn't happened maybe more than once in his career, but that's out there. I think it makes sense that he votes. It's also very clear in our charter that the mayor is a ceremonial figurehead. So he's not intended to be more powerful than any other member of city council when it comes to setting policy, because he is just one of 7 votes. And we run our community that way, and he runs it that way. Now, individual mayors can have personalities, right? Mayors can be very strong. Mayors run the council meeting, ceremonial figurehead. They run the council meeting. They run the workshop. So the workshop beforehand, where I have the agenda, it's his meeting. We start with, Your Honor, I'm ready when you are. And he'll say, Mark, let's start the meeting. And then he controls the meeting, who talks, who doesn't talk, whatnot. It works fine because his personality allows it to work fine. If the personality were very strong and more of a dictator role, it might be more difficult, but we don't have that issue. With that, I'm gonna transfer to Brian and step down because I believe I have gone over my time.